There we go. Thanks. Morning, everyone. Thanks very much for having me along. I took the opportunity last night to sit in the back and to listen to the three speakers that we had yesterday, Susie, Jeff and Doug, and essentially through a little bit of good luck and good planning, what I'm going to do overlaps with what they did a little bit, but builds on it and hopefully kind of pushes into more practical territory and builds off your third report a little bit more. But with completely good luck and atypically for economists, I think I'm going to agree with most of what they said, because I think, and in a whole lot of ways, I think the economics isn't that controversial here, but where I might become controversial is where I stray away from economics into politics, and my objective is not to lob, what did Jeff call them, hand grenades or something, but as I wade into some of the more kind of applied and political territory, I may find myself doing that, despite the fact that that's not my intention. But just in terms of the heading of the slide, I'm very deliberately, I'm a trained economist, but have been an applied policy, well, wonk, for lack of a better word, for a long time, and then for the last 5 or so years have been working in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, advising the PM directly and working closely with a bunch of ministers. And so it's been a long, slow, well, downward slide, you'd probably say, away from kind of pure economics to applied economics to having a much greater kind of understanding and sense of political processes and how politics and equity kind of fold in with economics. So what I'm going to try and do in this presentation is wrap them all together a little bit. And as I say, starting from a very similar economic foundation to the other three from last night, but then taking it a little bit further, hopefully, not too much further. So just the topics I'm going to cover this morning, 5 of them. To all of the others, well, Jeff and Susie raised the uncertainty point yesterday. I'll pick up on that and build on it, talk a little bit more about how you can manage it. Spillover benefits, again, came up yesterday. I'll talk a little bit more about that, how we think about it. And then wealth effects, when I will definitely take my economist hat off. Susie said yesterday absolutely that economists don't have a lot to say about how we should allocate units and look at other equity considerations. I agree with her completely, but I'm going to wade in there anyway. And then I'll talk a bit about specification of rights, although that does overlap quite a lot with what Susie said. And then a couple of final thoughts on your third report, which I reread a couple of days ago just to remind myself. So, uncertainty. I don't think anything here is too shocking. I mean, you put in your third report that it's important for councils to manage water takes in times of drought and severe water shortage, I'm sure that should say, not storage. And that's very sensible, you put it in there, but the obvious question is how we do that. Before I kind of go into the policy things, I think the first point is to differentiate between what economists call risk and what we call uncertainty. So risk is, by risk we mean when, a little bit like a lotto ticket, you know exactly what the chances of winning is, you know exactly what you'll get if you win, but it's still, there's still so you know all the probabilities, you know all the outcomes, you just don't know whether you are going to win or not. Uncertainty is something worse and more pervasive, where we don't know what the full range of possible outcomes are and or what their probabilities are, and that's much harder to prepare for. In the case of freshwater management, the distinction is possibly less clear-cut, because often I think when you're looking at a catchment, you'll have little bits of both kind of folded in or blurred together. But the underlying message on this slide is, which I think is really important, is it's far easier, not easy necessarily, but far easier to plan for expected and well understood variations in water availability and quality than it is to plan for unexpected and poorly understood ones. So the first thing on what we do, the first tool for managing uncertainty is actually to not try and manage it at all, but to try and reduce it as much as you can. You'll never reduce it entirely, but it's always better to get rid of as much as you can before you turn to manage it. True uncertainty is reduced by more information. I'm pretty sure that we already have very good data on rainfall and river flow variations in all major catchments, and I'm pretty sure that regional councils will have access to that. I think there's a question about whether we need to do more to get scientists, climate change scientists, to help us more about predict a bit more what scenarios we might face over the next 20 to 50 years. I mean, my very loose understanding is that we're going to get more severe El Nino and La Nina events, so no more frequency of either, but more severe oscillations. So, worse dry years and then worse wet years. So really, really critical that we work really hard to get as much information as we can together so that we reduce that uncertainty as much as possible. And then in terms of the risk, I mean, risk is harder to get rid of, but I think the key point is you can get rid of variations in river, in stream flows at least, if not groundwater flows, through better distribution and storage infrastructure. And I think it's really important to think about that infrastructure in that context. And I mean, Doug raised the comparison of California and Canterbury last night, and the point he didn't make that was in my head is both of them have the opportunity to take water from the wet side of the divide and take it to the dry side of the divide, but so far only California has. Canterbury hasn't, but California would be in. My understanding is that California takes a heck of a lot of its water from the wet side of the divide, and that has massively changed the Californian picture. So, infrastructure and it makes a huge difference in terms of both distribution of water around regions between catchments if possible, and storage obviously helps the seasonal flows. You won't be able to reduce either uncertainty or risk completely, so the next question is how you manage it. And I think I've framed this more in questions, but as Susie said, and I just completely agree with Susie, that you need to specify clearly in advance who's going to have what rights when things get bad. I put if/when, but you know that things are going to get bad sometime. Far better to have thought it out in advance. And this, might be some of my first hand grenades, but I think there are questions. So we've got the National Objectives Framework, and over time councils are specifying minimum flows and the like. But question, can they be breached? I mean, for short periods of time, I think already under the current framework, definitely. But do we need, if 30, 40 years out, is there a chance that we may need to think about having a second kind of minimum flow in emergency drought situations, which kind of replaces a normal year one? I'm not saying we definitely do, but I think we need to think about it. And if you're not willing to do that, then I think you do need to build the precautionary principle in when you're setting your minimum in-stream flows, so that you've got a buffer in the system to deal with extreme events coming down later on, because they almost certainly will. And when it comes to users, the third report, when I read it, I couldn't actually see anywhere that the third report said very explicitly that your proposition was that take rights should be expressed as a proportion of the total available water rather than in absolute terms. But it was kind of implied, and I think from my discussions with some of you, that is what you're proposing, and certainly I think that just makes perfect sense. I mean, Jeff and Susie both tilted that way, and I would just say that completely definitively, that at least a significant proportion of the rights that are going around need to be proportional, so that they just automatically flux in dry and wet years. But, and Susie raised this, many other jurisdictions have different bands of water security. So in dry years they cut off the least secure band first, and then when that's gone they go to the next secure. And you could potentially say, look, we want a small proportion of our rights to be fixed, to have no volume uncertainty at all. Or you could just have all bands being proportional, but with the least secure bands being cut first. But you certainly need to start thinking about that, whether you want that, because straight proportionality may well not give you enough, ability for people who really, really care about water security to make sure that their needs are protected. And then I also raised that last question, if rights are expressed as a proportion of the total available water, and that total available water just keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking in an extremely dry year, do you just keep reducing the rights proportionately a little bit by a little bit, or do you get to a stage where you say, look, maybe 30% or something, you just turn the rights off rather than just keep draining them down and down, because that could then give you the potential to introduce an emergency management regime if you turned all of the rights off, at a certain level and flipped into a new regime might make sense. These are just, ideas rather than strong proposals, but the ways that you can think about how you manage the risk that is remaining. And then I called them nuclear options, but maybe that's slightly overdone. But I also think, the previous slide was all about the stuff that you just absolutely, definitely will need to do beyond question to cope with fluctuations that are going to happen. But I also think you need to think through, not resolve them exactly, but at least begin to think through what you might do if things get really bad, if we have a really, a succession of bad El Nino years and the east gets way drier. At an absolute minimum, farmers, growers, etc. need to understand the risks they face and have a low or no water plan. But, you may well find yourself, in theory, the government shouldn't need to cancel or buy back take rights if everything is expressed proportionately, but, for nitrogen allowances they might need to. That's obviously what they've already done in Taupo. You need to kind of think about that, whether you might want to at least leave that open. And maybe for all of these things I've listed, whether you need to revisit NOF values, if you can revisit them if things get really bad in the future, whether you want to have a big push on storage and distribution, you might want to think about putting triggers in your regime to start all of those conversations. So say if such and such an outcome happens, then we automatically need to start looking at whether the MPS needs revisiting, or we need to start looking at a revised infrastructure plan, things like that. That I think you want to, for those more kind of nuclear options, you don't want to resolve them, but you want to plan for them and be aware that you might need them at some stage. Welcome, Alistair. I haven't got myself into trouble yet, I don't think. So that was all I was going to say about uncertainty, and I think that largely builds on what Susie said, but maybe takes it a little bit further. So the next is the spillover benefits, and there was a question last night about multiplier effects, and this may be my first hand grenade, or whatever we're calling them, but so I think just talking us through this a little bit, from an economist perspective, there's just no question that spillover effects are very common. Any factory, any road, and certainly any irrigated pasture creates wider economic benefits. I think there's no question about that. So I've said here modest, I've called them modest, but spillovers are very common. And while I haven't put it on the slide, I completely take the point from yesterday that the level of spillover can vary. So irrigation may, create more of a multiplier effect than, I don't know, a new poultry processing factory, bad example. But the key point here is the third bullet point. From an economist perspective, we only care if the spillover effects influence behaviour to such a degree that overall societal outcomes are worse off. And without going way too much through the jargon, just leaving free markets to work and leaving agents to do whatever they want to do works just fine, unless the social benefits, and technically the marginal benefit, but I won't explain that unless I need to, but essentially if the social benefits are greater than the private benefits, then you have a problem. Then you get underinvestment or undersupply and you get a socially inefficient outcome. That is absolutely a problem. But that situation is much narrower than the far more common spillover benefits. And so the two examples that I think are really well researched is research and development, but also primary school education are the key areas I know from the literature where everyone's really clear, the benefit to society of a kid going to school at primary level is actually greater than the benefit to the kid as a whole, where economists at least would argue that once you get to university the opposite is true and the benefit to the child is better than the benefit to the economy. And that's precisely why we, in Western countries at least, completely fund primary education and then nastily leave tertiary students to pay for themselves. So, getting a bit more to the chase, do irrigation spillovers warrant greater government support? My hand grenade may be one more slide later, but first to acknowledge that the government has definitely already acknowledged the importance of irrigation. I think there's just no question that large-scale irrigation, until very recently, hasn't been something that New Zealand has seen that much of. And so when I was at DPM&C, those two latest policies to encourage irrigation were introduced: the Acceleration Fund and Crown Irrigation Investments Limited. And the government, I think, definitely acknowledges that there are some things that make irrigation different. Unlike airports, unlike electricity generation stations, there aren't many large firms who are willing to undertake these schemes on their own back. What we almost always get is landowner consortia doing it. And also there's, in most regions, Canterbury being the beginning of an obvious exception, in most regions there's not enough distribution infrastructure, which makes the take-up risk really hard. So, on the slide I kind of put the hypothetical situation of trying as a commercial firm to build a new generation facility if you didn't have a national grid to plug into it. Makes it a much more risky and expensive proposition. So there are some things about irrigation that are different, and that has led the government already to provide greater support than it does for a bunch of other commercial investments. But the bad news is that, as an economist, and everyone loves to hate us for good reason, I just can't see any evidence at all to suggest that spillover benefits in relation to irrigation are, I should have put dramatically maybe, but spillover benefits, multiplier effects, they do vary, but I can't see any evidence to see in the irrigation context that they'd be dramatically bigger than for other productivity enhancements. But more importantly, I just can't see anything to suggest that the social benefits outweigh the private benefits. That, the question is, why wouldn't farmers be able to catch more than half of the benefit they get from irrigating? And I can't see how that could be the case. I can't see how that's like R&D. So my unpopular message is I don't think, on the basis of the multiplier effects or the spillover effects, that it's credible to ask for sort of nationwide support from the government. I think it would be stretching economics to argue on that basis. But what I think you can do is to argue for support for projects in particular areas on the basis of social and regional development grounds. I mean, you'll all be aware that over the last 3 or 4 years, concerns are growing, not just in New Zealand, but certainly including New Zealand, about the two-speed economy and the main cities progressing faster than the regions. And it's kind of a useful fact that a lot of our irrigation schemes are in regions or parts of the economy that are doing less well. So I think you certainly can argue for support for irrigation projects in particular areas on social and regional development grounds. But I'm afraid my personal view, at least, is that the multiplier effect or the positive spillover arguments probably won't fly. So that was me on spillover benefits. And then I was going to turn to wealth effects. And I'll explain what I mean by wealth effects in a sec. But I suppose the first thing I should say is that I'm most definitively leaving my inner economist behind as I move through the rest of the presentation. And I'm kind of increasingly adopting, at a minimum, my kind of dirtier applied economist hat, but on these slides in particular, drawing on my experience in political processes and drawing on my experience of what politicians really care about and how they operate. So the first point to point out is that wealth effects really, really matter. They're really controversial. I helped design the emissions trading scheme before I went to Prime Minister and Cabinet, and then worked through the amendments to that scheme when I was there. And ministers spend more time worrying about the wealth effects than they do just about anything else. They get economic benefits, they get why they want these things, but they're very worried and concerned about creating significant losers, because that kind of derails their ability to get a nice political consensus. So what does economics say to help us work through the issues? The answer is really not much at all. And Susie put that more articulately, or maybe more positively, last night when she said that because economics didn't matter, it was easier because you could just talk about the equity effects on their own and not have to worry about economics, which is maybe a nicer way of putting it. But economics doesn't help very much when we're talking about wealth effects. So economics is all about I think Susie and Jeff talked about this. Economics is all about maximising efficiency and therefore overall societal welfare. And there is, I'll be the first to own it, there is a growing body of evidence that says at an economy-wide level that high levels of income and wealth inequality matter in terms of economic growth. So economics is slowly coming around to the fact that that wealth effects do matter for efficiency and societal welfare for some degree, although we struggle to explain the mechanism clearly yet. But at a microeconomic level, we're still very much in that mindset that says what we care about is the overall pie, the overall level of societal welfare. And if a change increases the overall level of societal welfare, but makes some people worse off, from an economist's perspective, that's still a good thing to do. Because if they want to, it means that government could still compensate the people who are made worse off and leave some people better off, which is which is why we think that's a good change. But we actually stay silent on whether they should make good the people who are worse off. As Susie said, and I'll come to it again, economics does say quite a lot about the specification of rights. But most importantly, politicians, and we should all be extraordinarily grateful, politicians don't act like economists. They understand economists. They care about our arguments to some degree, but they really, really don't act like us, and they don't think like us. So that's kind of setting the scene. I'm now, in terms of wealth effects, my first question is about incumbents. How do you want to treat incumbents? And by incumbents, I mean people who have water consents already. And I suppose in all of this, I'm really worried about catchments that have or are approaching scarcity. As Susie, I think, said last night, if there's no scarcity, there's no problem. But so while I haven't said it, this slide and the ones following are more about the situation where scarcity is upon us or close to it. But your third report argues pretty heavily in favour of protecting the rights of incumbents, by my read anyway, and I'm happy to be corrected on this stuff. But stating the obvious, if a catchment's fully allocated or over-allocated, is just arithmetically not possible to protect all existing rights and at the same time help the landowners who haven't got water under the old first in first served regime to get some. You can't protect the incumbents and enable those who haven't got in the game yet. And again, economics doesn't have anything articulate to say about that problem at all. We just say, so long as there's an ability to transfer rights from one party to another, the initial allocation doesn't matter from an efficiency perspective. It obviously matters hugely, however, from an equity perspective. And therefore, politically, for political saleability, this is a huge issue. And these are my personal views, and absolutely, as I've said before, my last bullet point is not based on economics. It's based on my sense of watching the political system. So it's a subjective, non-economic view. But my guess is, I think that you won't manage to get a constituency you won't be able to get a critical political support if you don't tackle head-on the question of how to deal with landowners who weren't first in and first served, but who might want to get water later. That unless you deal with the wealth and equity aspects of that head-on, it'll be very hard to get your reform package over the line, is my first proposition. And there's a second wealth, I'll come to potential solutions in a minute, but before I do, there's a second wealth of kind of effect that I think you need to think about it. Less pernicious, I think, and possibly not a problem, but over time, water rights, like any other right, may well concentrate in terms of the holdings or the ownership. Ownership's a word that in some ways obscures, but anyway, whoever holds these rights, that may consolidate over time. That definitely has happened in relation to the fishing sector that Jeff talked about yesterday, only to some degree, but there has definitely been consolidation. Economists, we're not worth talking to on this. We just say that's fine. We don't have a problem with that. But I think politicians absolutely could become uncomfortable with the idea of water barons, to use a deliberately kind of emotional phrase, holding waterless landowners over a barrel. And even economists would start to get worried if in certain catchments there was a monopoly supplier of rights who could then exert monopoly control and reduce efficiency of the system. Now my take on this is that the best way to stop that problem is to don't have rights that exist in perpetuity and not to perfectly roll over the rights that you do have. I know I'm wading into territory that will make me unpopular, but it's the obvious way to stop it happening. I mean, in the fishing sector, they have two different types of right, but one of them is a perpetual right, very explicitly and very deliberately. If they're constantly, even if it's every 35 years, if they're constantly eroding slightly and then new rights are being reissued or re-auctioned or however you want, that just automatically stops the problem. The only other, I know that not everyone's going to love that idea, but the only other alternative that I can see would be to actually regulate the market, and I don't think anyone's going to love that idea either. So, you know, another of my messages here is, rather than focusing on the unappealing aspects of any one proposal, you need to compare how relatively unappealing different options are. So, what do we do about this whole wealth effects thing? You could just argue like crazy that the government shouldn't. You could say, don't you bloody well touch our rights. These are sacrosanct. I mean, my response would be, go for it if you like, but I wouldn't bet on success. Governments can and do frequently take actions that undermine the wealth of incumbents. And you know, even right of centre governments do. So some recent examples that came to mind, that, you know, minimum earthquake building standards have definitely done that. The emissions trading scheme did that to a degree, and land zoning changes can do that. So, you know, a whole lot of people would say they shouldn't, but they do, and saying they shouldn't may only get you so far. So again, my kind of politically pragmatic view would be to say far better to press for compensation. If you're an incumbent and your rights are being harmed, far better to say, if you do that, I want some compensation, than to run the kind of binary argument, you shouldn't, because I think it's kind of more politically practical. There's precedent for that in New Zealand. The emissions trading scheme, especially in the forestry sector, but actually no, in some large industrial sectors as well, the emissions trading scheme absolutely affected the rights of incumbents, but there was a really carefully crafted compensation scheme, phased out over time in some instances, but a really carefully crafted compensation scheme to make sure incumbents weren't hit too hard, too fast. And the associated benefit of all of this is, if the government has to pay when it undermines your rights, it'll just be a little bit more careful before it rushes in to do it, because it has to find the money from somewhere. And I've absolutely witnessed that firsthand in relation to the emissions trading scheme, that they say, well, yeah, we can see the benefits of compensation, but where the heck are we going to get the money from? So again, my kind of summary statement on the bottom of this slide, I've said if, but, you know, if it's not possible to fully protect the rights of existing right holders, which I'm afraid to say, don't shoot me, but I think that might be hard to do, and certainly in some catchments, in others it won't be. But if it's not possible to fully protect those rights, I think it's reasonable and very sensible to argue for at least partial compensation. And then, so that was all about incumbents. What about these people I'm calling waterless landowners? I didn't find good stats in my quick look in preparing this slide, but my sense is that there must be, that we almost certainly know that there are some landowners in catchments who haven't developed their land as intensively as their neighbours, who haven't therefore gone and got water consents. You know, those, I'm not giving them any great tactical advantage by saying this, they get this already. Those landowners without existing rights will be screaming from the rooftops saying that the incumbents may have been first in, but that doesn't mean that they're any more deserving. It doesn't mean that they should be treated differently, and that, you know, that accident of timing shouldn't be locked in. They will definitely be saying that. They said that in the ETS. That argument is well rehearsed, and it works. So again, this has nothing to do with economics. This is all my kind of experience with the political system. But my expectation is that you're going to need to tackle this question. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable, and it's costly. But I think if you stay mute about it, you'll struggle to get political support. But as I say in the fourth bullet point, there's no easy, there's certainly no inexpensive solutions to this. There's a whole lot of shades of grey, and there's a whole lot of choice, but at a really high level, there's two obvious things you can do. One is you can give money to these people. You can say, for whatever reason, didn't get a chance or didn't feel the need to get water consents, before the catchment became fully allocated, you weren't first in, but we get that you still have a need, we'll give you money so you can buy rights later. You could do that. I haven't run any figures, but I imagine the dollar signs could get quite high. But the other is you could say, look, anyone who reasonably could have applied for a water consent will be given a basic initial allocation. So, and again, I haven't looked at the maps, but there are some high country sheep farmers maybe who could never have applied for much water, but I think we know who could credibly have asked for water even if they haven't got it yet. And we could say, look, we'll give everyone a basic allocation that allows for a basic level of irrigated farming. But of course, if you're going to do that, you're going to need to, in a fully allocated or close to catchment, you're going to have to get those rights from somewhere to give to those people, and that would have to be done from a haircut out of the existing rights holders. As I say, they're not popular, they're not nice solutions. I think Jeff said yesterday there's no way around this. So I'm not deliberately trying to wind you all up. I just think if you don't tackle the stuff and start to discuss it, the risk is that you just won't be able to, that politicians won't engage with you because you won't be embracing the very problem they're most concerned about. All of my discussion so far has been about quantity allocation, but I think the same problem may, is that me? No, sorry. The same problem may arise in relation to nitrogen use rights depending on how that's grandparented, and the same solutions kind of work, so I won't bother running through all of that. But I think, the final bullet point, maybe I haven't fleshed out well enough, but ultimately, and I'm really heavily affected by the emissions trading scheme in this regard, the speed of change is just critical. Change, quite significant change, if it's done gradually over 20, 30 years, is get-awayable with, where radical, dramatic change isn't. So politicians, you see the way they think. They're trying to strike a balance between stakeholders, which in this case I think is incumbents versus what I'm calling the waterless landowners. They're trying to say, how do I strike that balance? But because doing it perfectly in the short term is bloody expensive, they will also be thinking about the time dimension and thinking, okay, can I mostly protect incumbents initially, but slowly over time give their rights small haircuts, every few years, and use that to free up resource that I can feed to newer entrants over time. Those will be the ways they kind of think about the things, and they'll be thinking really hard about the balance between the different stakeholders in the moment, but also over time. So that's enough on wealth effects, I think. Specification of rights, I think, Susie covered this pretty well, I think, so I won't belabor it. You said in your third report already that I'm really pleased to see that you're saying there needs to be some process for ensuring technical efficiency. I can't remember if that's the word you used, but basically make sure the incumbents are using their water efficiently enough. I think that's a really sensible thing to have put in. And you also put in that to allow transferability, that you need clarity, divisibility, exclusivity, and a separation of the site-specific consents from the take consents. All of that makes perfect sense to me. The things that actually Susie sparked in my mind last night, which I didn't bother adding to the slide overnight, was there is a question that I don't think you guys tackled in the third report, correct me if I'm wrong, about the extent to which you need to be location specific. And people, you can imagine a stretch of water without any major inflows. So, maybe you've got a 20-kilometre stretch of a river without any major inflows in it. You can allow complete trading, I would say, anywhere up and down that 20-kilometre stretch. If people downstream want to trade with people upstream, or vice versa, that'll work. But if you put a hydro dam in the middle of it, that changes, because even though at one level hydro is a non-consumptive use, it's non-consumptive at the bottom of the river, but it's not non-consumptive at the top. I mean, we've seen this in the Waitaki already, I think, that the hydro generators will care a lot about takes above their dam, and they will care very, very little about takes below their dam. So there is an element here that I know at the moment it's kind of done informally or administratively through the RMA, but we need to, as well as those things you put in there, which I think are all really good, we need to be thinking about the rights, whether or not you want to differentiate between consumptive takes or not. I find the distinction slightly blurry, but also how you think about the extent to which rights can be transferred across locations and how that changes. As I say, you might say, look, we don't need limits on transferability within this block, and then something might happen like a dam in the middle of it, which then changes it. So I think you need to think about that. And just in case you were getting bored, I thought I would piss off a few more people by saying what I think. Again, I'm putting my economics hat back on. So I think everything, and I know on these two issues about duration of consents and reissue of extent of consents that there wasn't a unanimous position in your third report, and you kind of kicked it for touch by saying it should be looked at. I forget the details. So maybe it's unhelpful of me to weigh in. But as an economist, I'm putting my economics hat back on again. I don't see economic arguments to say that consent should be automatically reissued on expiry, and nor do I see economic arguments that say that feel to me like durations beyond 35 years are preferable. For me, sorry to use the pun, but for me what really matters is that there are liquid markets where people can get water if they need it. You don't have to own water, you don't have to own it in perpetuity, you just need to know that if you have an economic use for water, which is profitable at whatever value water is going for at the time, that you can get some. That's what matters. And so, I put, sorry Hamish, whoever Hamish is, but I put the example of Tiwai Point down there. Tiwai, whoever originally built Tiwai, didn't need to own Manapuri Power Station or own the water, and I'm not entirely sure of the terms of that original deal that Meridian did, well, probably not Meridian back then, but anyway, that was done with those owners, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't longer than 35 years, and every now and again, as we know, they renegotiate it. So this is not an uncommon situation. Investor certainty matters, but I don't think you can argue from an economic perspective that you have to own a right in perpetuity to have sufficient investment certainty for people to be able to undertake these investments. And then just two final thoughts on your report so far. The first is probably stating the blindingly obvious, because I suspect it was well understood and well crafted, but when I read your report again just a week or so ago, I kind of felt there was a slight disconnect. So the report is fulsome in its support for transferability, but there was no consensus on charges or taxes. And taxes is a little bit different, but basically, and I think Susie said this last night, as soon as you allow transferability, there is a clear implication from an economist's perspective that these consents or rights, whatever you call them, will have a value and therefore some kind of price, unless the transferability is going to be done by a bureaucrat. That's just inevitable. So, prices aren't charges or taxes, but it just felt to me that there was an uneasy kind of disjunct in the report on those two issues, on squaring those two issues. So I thought I would unhelpfully highlight that again. And then last but not least, I thought a bit of the report that felt to me was a little bit overcooked was the question about how you manage the transition of a catchment from no scarcity, which is all well and good, to fully allocated. I think, my experience both looking at water but also other markets as an economist is that transition can be really, really messy. So, looking overseas, I say here that history overseas shows that where a catchment is fully allocated and where you have transferability, that's really important, that what you can go along in a really steady state and then you can get sudden, really dramatic changes really quickly, and the speed and the severity and sometimes the nature of those changes can take everyone by surprise. So the first thing is, as soon as water has significantly increased value, people start using it more efficiently. That's great, that's what we all want, but that can bite you in some ways that aren't expected. Suddenly people might irrigate less per hectare, which allows you to irrigate more hectares, which may mean simultaneously more N being applied, but also less water getting back into the river. So more efficient water use can ironically lead to worsened water challenges. It won't always, but it can sometimes. But again, second bullet point, when there's an endless supply of water consents, no one cares, and as soon as people think, shit, if I don't get in now, I may lose my chance ever, you suddenly can get runs on consents, and you've seen that. I can't name the catchments now, but I know that councils at times have put moratoria on the claiming, applications for consent for precisely that reason. Certain users and uses that are existing at the moment can suddenly just be priced out of the market. Again, economists say, great, that's what we want to see happen, but really awkward when people, real people with real livelihoods who need water for their businesses to run suddenly can't afford it. Real social and political sensitivity around that. I'm so not a hydrological expert, but my understanding from places like the Murray-Darling is that for groundwater, hydrological links are often not well enough understood, and that when you really pressure it, when you start driving more efficient uses, as soon as water has more value, that you can suddenly see hydrological links that you didn't realise were there and get unintended consequences. And as I say, I think most of you will know a bit about the Murray-Darling, but I've been to a couple of talks by people that were heavily involved in the creation of that scheme, and they're a great example of what not to do, but they weren't clowns. They just so weren't clowns. The Aussies are really good at designing careful, detailed schemes. They got it wrong, but they got it wrong because it was bloody hard, I would say, rather than because they were stupid. So we shouldn't look over there and kind of roll our eyes at how bad they were. I think we should look over there and be intimidated by how hard it can be. So all of this slide is really just to make that bottom point, which is that I think while what you've put in the third report was really sensible about transition arrangements, there was nothing in it that I didn't like. It felt to me like it only scratched the surface, that I think transition arrangements, when you shift from no scarcity and get closer to scarcity, that is undercooked in your fourth report, and maybe fifth one, needs to kind of tease that out a bit more. That was me. Thank you very much.